Following any election, a narrative begins to form over why results broke the way they did. If anything, the 2022 midterm elections demonstrated how divided we are as a nation. But exit poll data also revealed a factor that plays a large role in predicting how one will vote: marriage. In the 2022 elections, married people, both men and women, all as well as unmarried men, favored Republican candidates during this year's midterms. Meanwhile, unmarried women significantly favored Democrats. What do these preferences by category show us about the differences between the parties in 2022? And what does it tell us about the differences between men and women? Joining me now to discuss this is David Closson, the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview at Family Research Council. David, good to see you today.
Hey, good to see you, and happy early Thanksgiving, Joseph.
Happy early Thanksgiving to you and yours as well. Now, I want to dive into the specifics of these numbers. I teased them, but I want to give some specifics around this. 2022 general election, married men voted for Republicans. They favored Republicans by 20 points. Single men favored the GOP by 7 points. So married men are much more likely to vote for Republicans. Well, turns out that married women voted for the GOP by 14 points, but unmarried women voted for Democrats by 37 points. So you have married men, single men, and married women all voted who favored the Democrats, but unmarried women, as a demographic, favored Democrats by 37 points. David, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's so interesting to kind of dig into this data, Joseph. And I love elections. I love campaigns. And this is something that I just love doing, especially thinking about kind of what are the worldview implications of data like this. And, we're painting with a broad brush right here, but the data shows that the older one gets, if you are married, you are more likely to vote Republican. You are more likely to identify as conservative. And so to me, that's really, really interesting. I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. Some of this, Joseph, also tracks with some of the information we've looked at when we measure worldview. The older someone is, the more likely they think they'll have a biblical worldview. And the data shows the older one is in America, the more likely you will have a biblical worldview. So I think there's probably a couple of reasons for this, Joseph. The fact that you're married and you're looking out for a family and you're looking out for children probably has a lot to do with the issues you care about, rather than if you're just autonomous and single. So a lot going on with this data that's really interesting.
So for both men and women, marriage makes you more likely to prefer Republican candidates. Now, does that mean that marriage forms your worldview, so that those are the candidates you prefer? Or does your worldview determine whether or not you're going to get married?
I think it's probably the former, Joseph. So research we've done with George Barna shows that one's worldview begins to form around 15 to 18 months of age, and is kind of solidified by the age of 12 or 13. And then that's confirmed as one gets older and it's more solidified. It is really, really interesting to see, though, Joseph. Another correlation here is the more religious one is, the more likely you are to get married. So just looking at some stats from Pew Research, and this is a couple years old, theologically conservative denominations by far have higher rates of those who are in those churches who are married, and they also vote conservative. Let me just give you a couple examples. So this is, again, a couple years older, but about 48% of the adult population in America, just regardless of religion, is married. But then when you break that down by denomination, Evangelical Lutheran, 62% of those are married. The Anglican Church, 61% are married. United Methodist Church, 61% married. Southern Baptist, 60% are married. And one other one I'll give you is the Assemblies of God, 57% married. You compare that to those who identify as atheist. And again, a couple of years ago in the survey, it was on only 36% of those who identified as atheist were married. So that, I think that's really interesting to see. The more religious someone is, the more likely they're going to be married.
Well, and that seems to make a lot of sense to me because, marriage is an institution. There is Of course, we know that originally God created that institution, and as much as the government's trying to make it its creature these days, it is a pre-political institution that predates any kind of government structure, and that is ultimately, it's because of the way we were designed, because that's where children come from. But not everybody values marriage in that way. And so there is, again, a bit of a chicken and an egg question here about whether, being married makes you conservative or being conservative makes you married. I'm not sure we know that exactly, but another factor in all of this data has to do with children. And I saw data prior to the midterm election that showed that parents preferred Republicans to Democrats by 35 points. 35-point preference for Republicans to Democrats. So this fertility problem that we are having in the West, and it is not primarily a political problem, but we also see is the result of our infertility and our low birth rate is that is having an effect likely on how people are voting as well. And in some senses for the Republican Party, they need people to have children just because they need voters, not just from the next generation, from the current generation.
No, I agree with you, Joseph. And I think that's another one of the things about this data to me that is so interesting. And it's true that when you look at the data, especially when you look at unmarried women, trended Democrat plus 30%. And I think, in the previous segment you just had, you focused a lot on the abortion issue. And I think part of, when we reflect on the midterms and we reflect on the messaging, where was a lot of the messaging from the Democrat Party, the DNC, from the different candidates? They really went after the abortion issue, and they really targeted unmarried women. And they told, I would argue, they told lies that, if you, depending on how this election goes, you'll be forced to do things you don't want. You're going to lose control over your body. And so I think one part of this, this is so multifaceted, but part of this, Joseph, is the messaging. And I think the DNC in one sense was effective in really knowing who their audience was, which was, again, a lot of single women, messaging to them that a vote for a Republican was dangerous for their economy, for their well-being, for their future. And I think even, again, there's worldview implications here, but moving forward into the 2024 election, I think that's something that social conservatives, Republicans are going to have to think about, how we message to unmarried women, and how, even as my colleague Joy Stockbauer said, we need to make sure that these messages on abortion, the lies that the industry tells, we counter those with compelling stories of our own.
There's no doubt that abortion was made an issue, first by the Supreme Court in overturning Roe versus Wade, and then by the Democratic Party that tried to campaign largely on that issue throughout the summer and into the fall. And that could be part of the reason why you see 37% of unmarried women who prefer Democrats and may have this a sympathy for the issue of abortion. And I would say one of the reasons that matters is because not just because people like abortion, and I don't think most people do like abortion. There are some extremists that try to shout your abortion and celebrate it, but I think most people see it as, at best, a necessary evil. But the abortion issue is relevant here because these unmarried women and unmarried men have been told that sex makes you happy, and pregnancy is a result of sex. And they aren't prepared, in many cases, to give up sex because they think that means giving up happiness, but they don't want to have children. And therefore, abortion is kind of the remedy and the solution to the risk of happiness, which comes through sex. And for my money, we're not going to solve the demand side of the abortion problem until we have an effective response culturally to the lie that happiness comes from sex. And so many people believe that these days. But David, I want to dig into one other part of this gap between men and women and married men and women, and try to explore this a bit, because we noted that unmarried women preferred Democrats by 37 points, but married women preferred Republican candidates by 14 points. Does this mean that women are allowing their husbands to influence how they vote? And if so, is that just more evidence that the patriarchy is winning?
That's such a good question. And on this point, Joseph, Allie Beth Stuckey, One of the friends of FRC, she spoke at our Pray Vote Stand Summit. She did a little reel where she was, looking at the same data we're looking at. And one of the reasons she suggested, and she admitted it might be a little bit controversial, is that married women, when it comes to politics and when it comes to who they're going to vote for, have conversations with their husband, and they have conversations on politics and who to vote for, how that's going to affect their family, how that's going to affect their children. And because men generally tend a little bit conservative, she offered the suggestion that perhaps one of the reasons that married women vote a little bit more Republican than their unmarried peers is the resultant influence of their husbands. And I think there might be something to that. I would also add to that, Joseph, some of the issues, especially in the last year or so, I'm thinking of the Virginia gubernatorial race, that education has increasingly been on the ballot, and married women who are having children, they're really worried about what's being taught in the schools, and all of the things that FRC has been covering. And so I think, yes, I do think married women, when they go into the voting booth, they're thinking about their families, they're thinking about their children, they're thinking about more than just how this candidate might affect themselves.
Now, and we had that discussion with Corey DeAngelis earlier in the program today about how the issue of school choice and parents' rights is playing itself out in the political landscape. But David, we've talked about marriage, we've talked about gender, and we're going to layer one more demographic point across this and deal with age. And there's another interesting trend, and we've seen how it appears that marriage kind of pushes you to the right, politically speaking. But it also appears that aging does that as well. And of course, it's also true that as young people get older, they get married, right? So it'll be interesting to see which of these factors explain this move right most thoroughly. But in 2008, voters who were under 30 years old voted for Obama by 34 points. Now, in 2022, voters aged 30 to 34, so that's the same people who were under 30 when they voted for Obama in 2008, they preferred Democrats by just 4 points in the 2022 election. So 14 years later, the same cohort, the same group of people, they were preferring Democrats by 34 points when they were in their 20s. Now that they are in their 30s and 40s, they prefer Democrats by just 4 points. Is that also an indication that just age makes you wiser? You have parents, you have children, you start to care about different things. From a worldview perspective, what's happening here?
Yeah, and to add to the stats you just gave, Joseph, 18 to 29-year-olds in the exit polls for the midterms that just happened a couple of weeks ago, they favored Democrats by 28 points, which again, that's significant, but that's less than went for Obama, that younger demographic, which went for Obama by 34 points. And so I do think there's something to this, Joseph, as folks age and then they have to start paying bills. Last week, I toured some homes and had to think about interest rates and mortgage rates for the first time in my life. I'm 31 years old, and monetary policy, that matters. Taxes, those things start to matter. And I think this isn't a recent phenomena. I think of those, I'm a student of history, Joseph, and some folks in the 60s and 70s, the very anti-Vietnam War, who were radical liberals, who in the late 70s and 80s became much more conservative. So I know these are general trends, but I do think there's something to it, Joseph, that when you take on more responsibility in your life, when you get married, you begin to have to care for children. Eventually, you have to care for grandchildren. I think there is, we shouldn't be surprised that what we would identify as more conservative values begin to mean a lot more. And that is reflected in voting pattern. And so again, I'm not surprised that the older one gets, and if you're married versus if you're unmarried, the trends are leaning conservative based on the values of conservatism that empowers responsibility, it empowers families, values of marriage, values of life, things that begin to matter more, it seems, as you get older.
I also think it's notable that the school system has become increasingly radicalized in that same period of time. And I don't know to what extent that is affecting the way young people are feeling about these issues as they come out of school. Because again, 18 to 28-year-olds are by far on the left compared to on the right. But by a shrinking percentage. And to underscore that point, Morning Consult, a polling company, they said that since 2017, the percentage of the electorate identifying as very liberal, or somewhat liberal, so self-identification on the left, has dropped by 7 points in the last 5 years. Surely these things probably are connected. David, does this give you hope that even though we're becoming secular, we're coming to our senses in about 30 seconds?
It gives me some hope. But again, at the end of the day, Joseph, my hope's not going to be in America. It's going to be in the church. It's going to be in the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think that even some of the trends we've seen in politics, those merit or the life ballot issues getting voted down, that's problematic. So I think there's still a lot of work we need to do in the church to cultivate a biblical worldview, to think biblically about all things. But yes, there are some promising things in this polling, and we just need to keep praying for the country and working to instill good values to all people.
That's exactly right. It seems that our school system is doing what the left designed it to do, but as people live longer, they start to recover from that. But we'll continue to cover this. David, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Joseph.